Welcome, everyone. It is great to have you all here today. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this webinar. It's something that we've talked about a little bit before, but I'm really excited to be able to bring our friends at Blume Global to us today, along with Craig Hudson from Norfolk Southern. I'm really pleased to have you here for this session that we're calling Digitizing Intermodal. It is proudly sponsored by Blume Global, and we appreciate them doing that for us. We're going to hit on a few high-level themes today that I think will really resonate with folks. First up, we're going to hit on how is digitization improving connectivity in the intermodal space. I think we all talk about it, but we're going to dig into a little bit of how's that actually happening now for real. We're going to touch on how rail's a great alternative to moving cargo in and out of marine terminals in particular, because it's efficient and there's a critical backlog of goods. So I think that's going to be very topical. And then we're going to touch on how to create a beneficial and sustainable solution for repositioning. Empty containers play a huge role in obviously exports, but also moving stuff domestically and the ability of the asset owner to make decisions. So that's a critical piece as well. So with that, I am really pleased to welcome Pravinder Johar, who is the CEO of Blume Global, and Craig Hudson, who is the GVP of Customer Operations and Service at Norfolk Southern. Great folks, and if you don't know them yet, you will soon enough, because we're going to dig right into this. So with that, gents, why don't we just do a quick bit of introduction and let us know a little bit about yourself. So why don't we start with Pravinder? Go ahead and introduce yourself, Pravinder, and give us a little bit about your background and Blume.
Thank you, Hal. Good to be able to do this conversation with Craig and you. My background, over 30 years in supply chain technology for most of my career. Started off probably similar to Craig, more on the truckload and LTL side. So we had done products which helped optimize kind of the driver utilization, the asset utilization on that side. Worked for a large software company that we ended up selling the company to kind of at CTO. Then kind of was on the other side for Hewlett Packard, ran globally kind of the supply chain strategy and systems. So it was a different experience. And since that time, have been a CEO for a couple of supply chain software companies. One was in a supply chain planning space, and now Blume that we launched about 3 years back, though the Blume has a much longer history than the 3 years. So that's short background on me. Craig.
Thanks, Pravinder. Thanks, Al. It's great to be here and join you. Craig Hudson, been at Norfolk Southern for a little under 2 years now. I'm new to the whole industry, and it's exciting times to be here. I come out of the pharmaceutical industry, particularly animal health. I spent the majority of that doing customer operations and service. Before that, running their technology and IT group. So I have an IT as well as a customer service background with an engineering degree in civil. So for all of our railroaders or civil engineers,
Great. We share that, Craig, then. I also have an engineering degree and then a master's in CS and an MBA, but always an engineer.
Yes. It's great to be here.
Problem solvers to the core. We've got a lot of ground to cover and some really interesting topics that I think are going to resonate with everybody. And we're going to start out with a few questions around the impact of the pandemic. I think it's top of everybody's mind, and it's affected everyone personally as well as professionally. So the first question I want to throw out to you guys is, how has the recovery phase of the pandemic affected rail?
For NS, it's the recovery has been about increased volumes versus same time last year. Right. With the recovery in the customer supply chains, the pent-up consumer demand, and the government stimulus, volumes are higher, and we expect that growth to continue.
In terms of lessons learned, how do you think we will take the experience that we've got hard-won during the coronavirus pandemic and make sure that resonates throughout the industry? How can we help pick up those lessons and share them across the industry?
I think as Craig mentioned, right? So for NS, of course, the volume went up, but across the industry, many of us were surprised by kind of what actually happened versus what we thought, right? So if I go a year back, like Q2 of last year, there were a lot of changes, right? So the rail intermodal picked up for some of the essential services kind of at that time. And then it looks like that we have been in a never-ending peak, especially when it comes to rail and ocean, kind of since that time. But one lesson has been that almost everyone became digital when we started working from home, especially for people who use the technology part. Right? So many of our truck drivers and operators still had to go to work. They couldn't do it from home, but for majority of the industry, I think there was a big push on digitization. And I know some people were caught kind of little bit behind, kind of where work from home or work from anywhere was not really common kind of for our industry. It has become so much more common now than before. But the bigger part is kind of we just need to get kind of more agile in terms of how we operate. Right? Because these surprises used to happen kind of very infrequently. And we used to get kind of some events once a year, maybe once every 6 months or so. And then kind of nowadays that the change is the only thing which seems constant in our industry. Right? And then even now, as I look forward, I'm back to that hopefully kind of majority of us will get vaccinated kind of in the next 3, 4, 5 months. People will probably again have a different buying behavior. The travel and other pieces might pick up. What's the impact? And then that's a change. It is not kind of an impact on our industry out of that change where you can predict some of the pieces, but you can't predict them all. So it's the combination of that. And we are talking about digitization. How do we know that what is known and digital, and what's unknown, how good are we getting at predicting it? We will never be 100% good at predictions. Then how good are we or agile are we to be able to adapt to change in a very short time period is the biggest lesson learned kind of out of the last year. Craig, kind of, what do you think?
Oh, completely agree. Internally, we call them these episodic events that are now occurring very frequently.
Yes.
No, it's all about having increased resiliency and flexibility, right, with your processes, whether it's your customers, their supply chains, employees, to your point, the work from home, and assets. So it's been a good lesson for the railroad, and we'll get stronger once we come out of this. We'll be stronger.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's definitely a challenging time, but it's really kind of pressed creativity for sure. Craig, has NS had any major business process changes because of the pandemic?
Sure. Regarding intermodal, one specific that's near and dear to our hearts is our off-terminal dwell for chassis and containers has increased significantly. We were average about 9 days for off-terminal dwell pre-pandemic. Now we're around 12 days. So that's over a 30% gain, right? So the question is, which puts pressure on ours and our customers' fleet. So the question is that going to continue? Do we see this long-term elevated dwell moving forward? And we do actually. We see a big change here in supply chains. We don't believe it'll remain at 12 days, but it'll be higher than 9. We think customers hold on to equipment longer. That's a significant process change for us.
That's really substantial. Hey, Pravinder, in terms of third-party supply chain technology providers like Blume, can you see a way to help folks like Craig kind of navigate that new reality?
I think if you think of our history, so Blume's original name was kind of Reg 1, that most of the intermodal industry remembers us by, kind of from, I think NS and us, and along with UP have been partners now for 27 years, Craig, kind of on March 31. I think it's coming up next week. It will be 27 years are completed, kind of. So it's been a long history of seeing how do you build a digital ecosystem and how do we bring players together? Because one thing which is fairly kind of relevant, as Craig mentioned, kind of it's the customers holding on to the containers, right? What's the visibility on that side? Kind of what's going on with the dray community, the motor carriers which are involved in it, the railroads. We'll talk more about the ocean part of it, where you have another set of customers and another set of partners which need to work with. So what we have been focused on is kind of a industry neutral platform, which allowed you to share data appropriately, right? between the partners, which are all partners in the ecosystem, right? And so our customers and our customer suppliers are all partners, right? And there's been more willingness to share data because you see value that comes out of that data without compromising kind of anything competitive. And kind of when you're sharing it with your partners, you get a lot more value. Right? So as much as it is about the technology platform, it's also about the information. And then there is now so much information out there. How do we make it relevant, right? Like the asset part has been that every location can be tracked, and every location can be used for that asset utilization. So we'll talk more about it, but there's so many ways. But core of it is that it cannot be an island, right? Because if you are kind of doing just kind of for my own stuff, it's harder to do than doing it for the entire rail intermodal kind of industry with all type of partners. And the value that technology and platforms like us are creating is that how do we have kind of multiple parties who work with each other, collaborate kind of on a single technology platform to generate higher value for industry as a whole.
No, I totally agree with this. With the change that the pandemic caused, speed to market with technology solutions is where a third-party supply chain technology company can really come into play. The new reality is going to require fast and quick changes.
That makes loads of sense, guys. One of the things that is really to me interesting, but also particularly challenging, I think, for rails and customers is managing interline schedules. It's a critical piece of the intermodal network, but it's also one of the more challenging handoff components. So, Pravinder, I know that you guys have done some work on interline schedules and trying to make them a little easier to use and make them more approachable for intermodal users. Could you talk a little bit about your experience there and what you found?
I think even before I talk about the schedule itself, the entire movement for the last 3-4 years has been that how do we make rail intermodal or ocean intermodal more predictable? And to make it predictable, you have to start off with knowing kind of what I'm expecting, right? So you have to start off with a schedule, right, to know that what is it. And then when we look at schedules, kind of as Blume, kind of we look at not just interline schedules, we also look at sailing schedules for ocean carriers. Right? We look at air cargo providers and their schedules. We look at parcel schedules, kind of, and then what are the commitments for them, right? But for rail in particular, we've been fortunate to be able to work with kind of our customers like NS to say that how do we publish kind of these schedules, how do we keep them current, and how the customer base can get access to those schedules. And then the way we are doing it kind of on the scheduling side, that it's not that any of our railroad customers have to go and buy something to access it. It's just that part of the service that you do need to have the schedules available so you can make better decisions on what you will do in terms of movement of your cargo. And then we talk about interline schedules, but the reality is that its schedules are not only between two railroads, it's also between ocean carriers and railroads. It's also if you go to somewhere like Chicago and you're going to do a rubber tire move, kind of between the two locations. What's that scheduling? Right? It might not look like a schedule help, but it still is that I want to know how long does it take. What do I go plan for? We look at kind of ocean terminals. We say, okay, what's the dwell there, and how long does it take you to get in and out? So the broadly, when at Blume we talk about scheduling, we're talking about all type of schedules, but for rail intermodal, that's definitely kind of a key component for our customer base and their customers. Right? So we view both NS as a customer, but all of NS customers, we have to serve them as well as we possibly can. So we always go kind of, it's not only about our direct customers, it's also about their customers and getting the most value. And interline just fits right there.
That makes sense. It's a sort of a philosophy of balancing all those inputs for the maximum output. In terms of that, what have the challenges been historically for approaching that kind of need?
more for me from or Craig, your perspective. See, my perspective has been that broader one, and it's kind of it's not just for rail, right? So if I think 20 years back when I was working with truckload carriers and LTL carriers, there was a lot of push for them to get efficient and become visible because the spend was just larger. Right?
Yeah.
So if you think of the US retailers, US CPG companies, the amount of spend they had on the truckload and LTL, there was a lot of pressure. Right? If you remember Qualcomm devices getting on or Traxons getting on the trailers, kind of that was all 2003, 4 is when we were talking about it. But the reason was that that was a bigger part of the spend. So there was a lot of focus and pressure that got in. And then on the rail intermodal and ocean intermodal, it was relatively lower spend, even though it's a lot of spend, but it's a relatively lower spend that we had from the shippers. Things have changed now, right? Things have changed where we have one, we all know that rail is better from environmental perspective, right? Kind of than it is for the long haul truckload. We know that for the ocean, we again kind of there's a huge environmental impact going on, and ocean and rail go together, kind of to some extent. And overall, our just manufacturing processes have changed. Right, 20 years back, when all of that spend was and to focus on scheduling on truckload and LTL side, we used to manufacture a lot more in the country and ship in country. But if you compare to 2000 to 2020, right, how much of it is cross-border now? Right? It's just a completely different dynamics. I don't think there were challenges. I think it's a matter of focus and the focus, where the focus is. And then timing in the last 2-3 years has been ripe for rail intermodal, that there's an increased focus on it, and hopefully kind of it helps overall industry, and it helps the environment at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's great. Hey, Craig, from your perspective, how does things like the interline schedule optimization help you in your daily business?
Sure. For us, it's a key piece of our strategy. It's all about making it easy for our customers to do business with us. So for NS, we want to provide a service that has the ease of truck with the efficiency of rail. And the interline schedule is a great example of that. Our customers have an easy access to schedules, the billing, payments, the whole thing through Blume, through one organization, versus having to piecemeal that together. So it makes it much easier for our customers.
Yeah, and that has to be sort of top of mind, I would think, because it's so critical for their immediate satisfaction. But obviously, we want to build a long-term relationship to keep the customers coming back, right? Excellent. Let's move on to capacity. It's always a topic, but I think it's no more than, at least in my fairly short term in intermodal of about 5 years, it's never been more of an interesting topic to talk about. One of the major promises of digitization in the supply chain is helping carriers, increase awareness of their assets, both chassis and containers, right? So how does digitization improve the ability to find a container and a chassis capacity from your two perspectives?
One of the things we did in 2018, that we actually had an engagement with Boston Consulting Group. We brought them in. We got permission from all of our customers, right? So NS actually participated in it, where we can look at the real data on asset utilization, capacity, and look at the macro level, what is possible. Yeah, so the 3 years back, that's kind of the journey we had started at Blume to say that, okay, in addition to our own data scientists and PhDs, let's have someone else come in and look at it, that what's really possible. And what we saw, that we still were at a place where assets were underutilized. Right? If you compare it to what happens on truckload side, how often you go from full load to full load versus what was going on with the rail intermodal, there were plenty of opportunities for us to improve it. The second part which was there, that it was not possible to do it in a silo, because even though they're large railroads, but if you think of our intermodal marketing companies community, there are several of them. So it's a fairly fragmented market for you to get the entire visibility to know what that would look like. right? Which is where kind of for us, it became that for a platform like Blume, because we see a lot, right, kind of across multiple platforms. And then you have to be able to apply the science, which is what the focus has been, to increase asset utilization. And part of that utilization increase comes from doing things like asset optimization on that side. And I know we'll talk more about it in a little bit. But part one of knowing what capacity I have, you have to get visibility into where your assets are. And so very fundamental part has been that do we have visibility into where our assets are? And we'll talk a little bit more kind of later that where will the assets be is the second stage, right? So on our first stage for capacity is that just know what the capacity is, that how many empty containers are sitting kind of at a shipper's DC, right? Are they available or not? Because I think if I think of it, it's common. And when someone gets a full container kind of as a shipper, there's a lot of attention to it that let's get it into a warehouse. Once the container is empty and someone has to go pick it up, you don't really worry about it as much as you worry about a full container. A full container might be worth a lot of money. An empty container is just that it's something I have to go do, but it's not really get the same sense of urgency. And I'm not saying it in any bad way. This is natural for all of us in our personal life too, right? So if you I'm thinking of my own home, and my wife and daughter have plenty of Amazon stuff and other stuff coming to the house. They will empty that box very quickly. But then it's my turn every week to go and put them in the trash outside because no one cares about that those empty boxes that sitting in the living room kind of for the whole week. It's no different about that. So I think part one for us was just the visibility, just know where the stuff is, where is the capacity, and then the technology on how do I go use that capacity which is available. And it was more than what we thought was available once you get the visibility on the street versus just kind of on a container yard.
Yeah, that's right. I couldn't add anything more to that. Exactly right. We have to know exactly where they are.
Yeah.
Then, to overcome some of the challenges, right? We need good quality and visibility of data, and it needs to be aggregated into actionable information. And that's something that's key to us going forward.
That makes loads of sense, Craig. From your perspective, where have the customers come down? Have they been looking for more information that would require sort of a deeper knowledge of asset location?
Sure, especially during this time of the pandemic. As I mentioned, our off-terminal dwell for chassis and containers went from 9 to 12 days. So by optimizing the assets, we can improve the customer experience. Having the right asset, obviously, it's having the right asset at the right time and the place where the customer needs it. So if we can share and communicate that with the customer, that would, I think, go a long way improving the customer experience.
Yeah. No, that makes loads of sense. And I think there's probably an element of education as well. Because I know that some asset providers have had challenges with customers, basically using the assets as excess storage. And while I understand that, it doesn't really help your business partners to be able to, bring you the next load if you're using the box that this one came in as overload. So there's definitely probably some opportunity for education there as well. Pravinder, can you tell me how Blume views the issue of asset optimization and what you guys are doing to solve the transparency challenges that still exist in the market?
And I think part of it has been that there are many, many different ways to solve the problem, right? In there too. So we do many of them, right? So some of the cases we have customers who have GPS or IoT devices on the containers or on the chassis, and we can keep track of where they are. We think it's kind of not always necessary, right? Because we also have an ecosystem of the dray carriers, because someone picks up the container, someone drops off the container, and those end locations are the one which matter the most for utilization. While it's on the road or knowing exactly where it is, kind of you can't really utilize it as much, right? So our focus is that you can go very high tech that I want IoT device on every, or you can go semi high tech where if you just know where it last got dropped off, right? Which is why we connect kind of the dray carriers with the who are moving the containers and chassis together, because you can get the same answer on that side. The science part, which we looked at, Hal, was something which I've done in my career for consumer goods or products, is what we applied to containers and chassis. Right? So there are demand forecasting techniques, right? So which is why we use kind of these machine learning and kind of cognitive learning techniques, that how do I forecast what the demand is going to be. There are similarly supply forecasting techniques, right? So we are applying the supply forecast to say, right? And when you look at those for the at a very macro level, you end up with what your surplus locations are, what your deficit locations are. They can be metros, they can be kind of a particular location within the metro, right? And then how do you go use that information on deciding which asset will I assign to a new load, right? Because you want to make sure that if you solve the problem not only for today, right? So if you kind of do a very rudimentary solution, it will be that I'm doing demand supply matching between demand for containers and supply for today, right? But what you miss out on it is that you might be creating a bigger problem for tomorrow or 10 days from now, right? So a lot of this kind of what we do from Blume perspective has been that it's not only about today, it is about that where will the asset end up. And if you're going to start seeing a demand because it's a agricultural season or a cotton season kind of somewhere else, the demand is going to show up. So start positioning the assets now versus just solve for kind of what is going on today. So a lot of our work is on that to really get the good asset utilization. Visibility is the foundation, but equally is the forecasting of demand and forecasting of supply, and knowing that how I'm using the asset today to have a better solution kind of in future. Now, with all forecasting, all machine learning, there's always a chance of an error, right? So you have to live with that error and kind of make sure that you can adapt to it because no one can predict the future 100% of the time, right? So we do all those pieces, but for Blume, it's not kind of, so visibility tells you where you are. That today it's real demand and real kind of supply, but you also have to predict kind of what would be the demand and what would be the supply and where will it be, because we deal with not only kind of the product, which is a container or a chassis, we also deal with this time space kind of issue, that it takes time for a container to go from one part of the country to the other, right? Or a chassis to travel or reposition kind of from one to the other. So how do you go do those two things simultaneously? Which is where a lot of kind of our R&D work has gone, is kind of figuring out. And as you can imagine, when the reason we call it R&D, that we had plenty of failures in 2018 and 19 before we had a good solutions in 20 and 21. But they're all related to that. How do you continue to improve the asset utilization?
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. It reminds me of that old adage, the shortest distance isn't necessarily a straight line all the time. And you must rely on analytics, both of you, to kind of help you through this increasingly complex world of variables. Craig, from NS's perspective, what kind of internal discussions have you guys had when you're choosing whether to outsource a supply chain technology or build internally?
Yeah, this is where I've seen a real positive change in our environment, and I could say maybe other railroads. Today it's all about delivering high value faster with higher quality, and then having your systems and processes stay current and not become technologically obsolete. Right. So outsource providers have a financial interest in continuing to improve their product, because without it, they'd be, they would not remain relevant. And as Pravinder just said, they have an R&D department that does exactly this. Right. And it's difficult for internal IT shops to have an R&D department when there's demand is so high for just projects in themselves. Yeah. So, we see that, and the railroads have seen that. For example, I'll give an example. I believe most Class 1s are on the Salesforce Service Cloud product. Right. So we see the benefit of that by everyone getting the improvement when Salesforce makes an improvement to their product. And so with that and the other cloud-based technologies, I think the discussion has shifted from this buy versus build to a what can deliver value faster and how can we stay current with the market.
That's a great watchword that I think is going to resonate throughout this is that that speed to market and that market resonance. So I think that's some great insights. We touched on it before, but let's dig in a little bit more into sustainability. I mean, it's a personal topic of interest to me, and I know it's top of mind for you folks as well. In terms of sustainability, how has it become a driving factor in decision making for intermodal stakeholders from both your perspectives?
I would just say that if there's ever a time and place for the intermodal industry, this is it. With rail being much more environmentally friendly, with the potential of one train carrying up to 300 trucks or removing 300 trucks off our highways, this is our time.
Absolutely. And I think for us, I will give you maybe a history of why we named the company Blume, right? So kind of it stood for that blooming, growing organic ecosystem. And there was so much of the back to the nature and environmental components too, kind of that we looked at in every aspects, right? As a company, this year we will become carbon neutral, right? Because there's a way for you to become carbon neutral. Yeah. But the focus for us is use the technology to minimize the carbon footprint usage, right? And then I think we offer kind of, if there's some of our customers, they can track how much carbon footprint is being used. So you don't decide only on the basis of price or the amount of time it takes. You can also decide on top of kind of how do I minimize the carbon footprint that I'm going to be using. And of course, kind of it depends on every company, kind of if they have minimized it, it's their choice whether they want to become neutral or not, right? But we can at least start off with that we're telling you or being transparent, and that how you can optimize for carbon carbon usage at a lowest point. And I think street turns are part of it, right? The asset optimization that we talked about is again part of it. Right? For us, it was a little bit counterintuitive too, right? So I remember having a discussion with one of our railroad customers in 2018, says that really you want us to minimize the number of containers we have. Yes, I said you should buy only as much as it's enough, because every less container you buy or more container you use, there's a big environmental impact just in terms of manufacturing cost or what goes into manufacturing of that particular container. So it's not only about kind of improving the utilization, but if you take back that kind of what's the carbon footprint impact. There are so many other impacts which are all related to it. But I didn't know if you guys knew the name Blume. It's a German spelling for Blume, because there were too many other companies with BLOOM. So we went with the German spelling, but the whole thing came out of sustainability being a key factor or key driving force for us. So we went back to that whole kind of nature part to even name the company. So it's in our DNA.
That's excellent. I didn't realize that, Pravinder. That's a great little bit of insight, and it does speak to kind of where you are coming from. In terms of that, for both of you, are you seeing the end customer driving that as well? Are they coming to you and saying, we want to be more environmentally responsible, we want to be more sustainable?
We're seeing it from everyone, right? Whether it's the end customer, investors, consumers, all the way to employees. If you think about employees, it's generational. People in their 20s and 30s that work in every industry for all of our companies, they factor sustainability into their decision making at a much greater degree than we did in the 80s. We grew up, greed is good, right? Which is not a good term, but today it's great that they're factoring in sustainability, right? So that's a wonderful thing.
It makes loads of sense. In terms of NS, how has the railroad focused on sustainability in terms of the messaging out to the customers?
It's very important to us, right? So a few facts here. We help our customers avoid almost about 15 million metric tons of carbon emissions every year, just by shipping with us versus the highway, right? Additionally, we have programs we have a program called Trains to Trees. That's 10,000 acres, 6 million trees, and that captures 50,000 metric tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. So we have a mitigation program that provides opportunities for our customers to offset their rail emissions to meet their environmental goals and become carbon neutral in their supply chain.
That's awesome.
Yeah, let me have one more, because this is specific intermodal that I just thought of. We're also investing heavily for intermodal. We're investing heavily in hybrid cranes. Interestingly, they're less expensive to operate. They're higher reliability, but they're very good for the environment, right, and for the communities in which we operate. So we'll move forward with hybrid cranes as an example.
That makes loads of sense. A wise person told me that the most efficient power unit is one that isn't idling at a clogged up terminal, and that does not affect a train that's pulling the equivalent of nearly 300. I mean, that's a stunning number when you think about what you guys can get on a fully loaded intermodal train these days. So, in terms of container repositioning, that strikes me as a process that could really help meet sustainability goals. Do you guys agree that a container repositioning program could make that a little bit easier to meet your sustainability goals?
I think yes, and I think I think Hal and Craig, you guys probably already know that we do fair amount of that work now with the ocean carriers. And some of all of it is in collaboration with our railroad customers, right? But for their empty container repositioning, we call it the domestic reload program, right? And then there are some customers who work with us directly. Some customers work with our railroad customers in turn. To be able to go do it. But it's been a fairly kind of successful model for using the containers for domestic use, right? And then they get used on the railroad, right? So still is that it's moving on a rail too. But that was one example kind of sustainability, is that instead of moving those containers empty, can they be filled and moved and get to the right set of locations? We have had this program in place now for a while. I won't share the names of the customers kind of who are there. Just think of it, some of the larger ocean carriers in the world are using it actively. And it's the same, but that's more on the domestic repositioning of marine containers. But there's equally kind of the work that needs to happen on things like chassis repositioning, even between terminals, right? Because it's the same issues. Even if you go to a single kind of marine terminal area, you call it LA, Long Beach or others, there's a fair amount of repositioning that needs to be done in an efficient manner.
Are there other solutions like that are possible that would help increase efficiency and meet sustainability goals? I'm thinking street turns in particular.
So I think the way we look at street turn, and it's been different too, because street turn as a term has been around forever. Like, it's like that people have tried to do it. Problem is that are they executable or not, right? And then that's kind of where the trick was. So the discussion we were doing about asset optimization first. The one way we look at it is that in case of ocean, it's really turning a box for export from import, right? So it's an import-export matching. In case of rail intermodal, it is effective use of that asset no matter where it is, right? So for a asset to go back to a depot and kind of have a 50-mile drive versus just to drive 45-mile back to go 5 mile next to the where it originated as an empty, right? How do you eliminate it, right? So we have been working on that kind of on the street turn one, right? But we took that street turn to that next level kind of health, which is what we call asset optimization, an ability for you to assign an asset no matter what the location is, right? And then that gives you the street turn, but it gives you more than the street turn, because on the street turn, you were relying on a motor carrier to make a decision on that particular box. If you take it 5 years out, and if our customers like NS, kind of, if you knew where all the empties are, and not only when they're going to become empty, instead of that reservation being made only at the locations which are used to be in Reg 1, kind of our name came out of that reservation system, only on those locations. Can those reservations be made from any location the asset is getting empty and ending, can have a huge improvement for the industry. So that's the direction we have been going. So street turns is part of it, but we are saying that why would you make a reservation only at the known pool locations? If you knew this is where the asset is and it's going to get empty on next Thursday, right? Why can't you use that location and then allow people to reserve that asset too? I guess reservation is not going out of Blume's whole nomenclature, because even for street turn, we went back to kind of how do you assign an asset for which particular move.
No,
That makes sense. Kind of that's kind of how we are looking at
yeah,
it.
for
Make
sure.
every location where you can assign an asset from, versus having them ever come back to a depot unless they have to, meaning there is no other use.
Having that perspective to be able to see more of the game board would strike me as being a huge component of that, and really opening up possibilities for your partners and the partners' customers. So it's you're really making the network much more flexible. Just simply utilizing the assets that are in it and available, just perhaps not entirely visible to the naked eye, if you will. One of the things that I think potentially plays into both that and how to manage demand coming out of this particular challenging time that we've been in is dynamic pricing. And the airlines have been pricing seats and cargo capacity based on supply and demand for ages. Do you see it as time for the railroads to start exploring dynamic pricing?
I'll start with the basics, right? Which is, I think we see how it could be beneficial when it comes to leveling supply and demand, right? Which is what it did for the airlines. I think for the railroad industry to get there, we need to ensure we have a predictable and consistent service delivery product. Mm-hmm. And the airlines, I believe, started a lot of the yield management pricing when they ensured that they can have somewhat guaranteed on-time product.
Right.
Yeah. And I think what I will add to it, Craig, you have to get to predictable service first, right? So, but the second part of that predictable service is that it also works on the model of how early do I know that I am going to be going to make a reservation. If you think of the airline side, it's not only the demand and supply. There's also a factor of that how quickly are you locking in with that demand, right? In our personal lives, if you think of it, these days all airfare things are are unpredictable. So let's assume we were back in 2019, right? No. If you had, there was a day and time when you could predict, and I don't know if you guys did it or not. Depending on the airline, you knew that if you looked for a fare on a Tuesday 3 weeks back, you got a different one than on a Sunday. Because you can predict when they're repricing it, right? There, and there were days when it was the cheapest, and there were days where it was the highest. So it's not only demand supply at the last minute, right, where you have more work to go do. It's also that how quickly are you locking in, and then it's definitely possible for the railroads, right? The technology is there to help do yield management and pricing. Right? It needs to be more of a business process change, and the change that needs to happen versus less of a technology issue on dynamic pricing.
That makes sense. Craig, do you think that rail customers are in a position to accept dynamic pricing?
I don't know. I would be hesitant to say one way or the other without some more research on that one. With a predictive and consistent service, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And that certainly seems like those have all been going in the right direction with network rationalization and kind of refocusing on that customer experience. It seems like that those building blocks are kind of coming into place. So we'll watch this space, and we'll see where it goes. We'll get you guys back, and we can talk about it next year maybe and see where we are. We're coming up on it. There's a couple other questions I'd like to try to tease in before we jump to the questions from the audience. And one of them is just in general, from your perspectives, what kind of metrics should carriers be looking at as they monitor the success of their supply chain digitization process?
So for us, and this is from some of even customers of our customers, right? So if I look at not just the customer side of it, because you always have to have an outside in perspective on digitization versus just internal one. So my recommendation typically is that do your customers think you are digital, and they kind of look at the number of manual steps which are involved and the number of delays which are there, kind of, right? Are things streamlined kind of on that side or not? So many of the metrics have been around. I think there was one customer who told me that the systems they were using, they had counted like 38 manual steps, right? And if the providers get more digital, is the 38 going down to 30, eventually going down to 25? It's the case, is it a 2-step, 3-step process? What is it, right? So how many of the places where things get, I won't call it stuck, but things need a manual intervention, right? And then how many of those manual interventions are you removing? So you first have to be able to benchmark that how manual are we versus digital, right? Kind of that's so on the KPIs, if you don't have the starting point, it's hard to measure are we improving or not. And for many organizations, the first issue is that we are digital. Everyone has been digital for a while. It's kind of what the first reaction is. But then you have to figure out a KPI that you can measure that what is it taking. Second part of digital, which is trickier. See, this one is easier, Hal, right? Second one is trickier, is that how much of the knowledge is stuck in people's head versus how much of it is really in the system so you can use it, right? Now, I used to call it, and I still call it, that how much of it is the yellow sticky culture, where you have an operator or someone in customer service, they have a bunch of yellow stickies knowing that how many, this customer, if they call, this is what they do, right? Or how much of it is now digital, where you've taken that knowledge and you've eliminated the yellow stickies, and now you have figured out that how I'm going to be automating it, right? And there are plenty of metrics and KPI you can go down on that one. That's harder. First one is easier. First one is that how many manual steps and how do I reduce it? And there are many more, but I look at it kind of in those two dimensions. One is manual steps, and second is knowledge being in yellow stickies for the lack of any other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We have two significant, among many others, digitization projects, and one being exactly what Pravinder just said about capturing knowledge, and that's in our pricing area, right? So instead of using spreadsheets and a lot of that, we're going to use systems going forward, and that'll help capture that knowledge. The other one we're looking at is, providing mobile technology to all crews out in the field, right? So there, the technology works. It's an adoption thing. How do we get the change management and adoption? So that would be a very large metric for us to measure.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And focus on those big gains that'll make a system-wide improvement that really kind of makes for a foundation to be able to leap to the next more challenging level of eliminating the sticky notes as much as possible. I want to make sure we get some questions in from our audience. We've got a number here, so I'm just going to go ahead and pivot over to those. We've got a few interesting ones here. And here's one actually going back to sort of the Internet of Things conversation that we were having, touching on at least, is this question is, do you have a need for high security environmental padlocks to secure containers in intermodal? Folks are looking at the smart features on locks and asset tracking and those kinds of things. How do they fold into the digital future that you guys see?
So I think broadly, my answer on IoT, kind of on logistics, kind of start off with the value of the product that is in the container or in the asset, right? And two, how critical is it for you to keep track of that, what's going on with the environment around that product on an ongoing basis? What I mean by that if you're transporting kind of vegetables or milk or dairy, right? Kind of there, you need IoT devices more for the reason of that knowing what was the temperature, right? Or if you got kind of things moving and it's going to be bananas which need to be ripened while kind of they're moving in a container. So how do I keep track of it? So there kind of there's a higher value, right? And then you also get into that if you're moving high value goods, right? And then kind of all the security features are even more critical, right? If you think of high tech, which may not apply in all cases, but in many cases you want to know if something was dropped, right? So we deal with air cargo. And in air cargo, if you drop kind of an electronic item and you're sensing kind of the pressure and others, so there are many uses of those IoT and Internet of Things on, right? The GPS is kind of more on the low end of it because it just tells you the location, kind of, right? There are other uses now, kind of, for example, knowing whether the container is empty or full. Because you can do a video technology to know, and there's a value for it. But each one of these technologies come at a cost, and they provide a value. So there's not a generic answer for each in there because they're technology, but then you also need to know what the business value is held kind of on that side, or the person asking question. The security becomes the same thing. What am I securing? It's equally critical, from that IoT perspective.
That makes sense. Craig, are you guys exploring different kinds of IoT technologies?
Oh, we are. We have and I saw a question in the future about it. We announced the Rail Pulse initiative. That's first for rail cars, but we're also looking at something similar for chassis and containers.
Are you able to talk a little bit about the Rail Pulse platform and how it it folds in with your other initiatives?
Well, just current stage, right? Right now, we're just going through, what are some of the use cases we can use with this data, and where's the biggest need first, right? Back to delivering high value first.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
The technology solution's there, right? We know how to put sensors on just about anything. It's what's the biggest use case for the data, and we're going through that analysis now. I'd love to hear Pravinder's thoughts on that.
I think kind of maybe it's a longer conversation, right? Because I've had kind of some places, the easiest thing to do are not necessarily the best things to do early on, right, Craig? And that's kind of what I've seen, that a lot of the use cases come up with that this is easy to do. Like when I was talking about that GPS, it's easy to do. I can know where something is. And my question is, so what will you do if you knew something was there? Now, if you knew it, that kind of chassis has a flat tire or something else has to be happen, then there's a lot of value kind of on it. And then my question becomes, okay, you can put a GPS on that, but then isn't the driver going to tell you that kind of they have a flat tire? So what's the value? So I go through this kind of 5 why kind of type of a discussion on IoTs, right? That why do you need it? And the second why and third, it's not till you get to 4th or 5th that you know that this is the one where to apply kind of the technology. Versus the first few usually are that it's convenient and it sounds good, and then you get to that it's the value.
Here's a question that is sort of approaching it from the other end of the spectrum on payments and digital payments. And the question is, one of the element of the move to digital is digital payments to keep the process flowing. You guys have any thoughts on that?
I think, for us, like if you go all the way back to Reg 1 and how we do billing and how we do kind of electronic billing, and then technology had changed, right? So kind of it's used to be ACH kind of for a long time for electronic payments on that side, which is what we still use. Many of the places it is new forms of payments being used, right? So we have a customer which does a lot of chassis repair. Part of it, and then many of those guys are getting paid kind of now, not just a credit card, but kind of the newer digital payment technologies which are there. It's not really about the payment, it's about knowing that are you paying the right amount. And then sometimes we confuse the two on the payment. So there's one part which is the audit or knowing that it's the right amount, and then it's the actual payment. And the actual payment part, yes, there's a digital payment technology which we can use all of it, but it's equally critical to know that it's the right amount that I'm charging or right amount I'm paying, which is where a lot of the technology is helping. And then I think it's a longer discussion, but that goes back into the real-time visibility into what all has happened, right? And where the stuff was, right? If you look at repair, knowing what the repair was, is it reasonable? Is it the same rate? So a lot of the digitization pieces are related to that knowing what to pay, in addition to using a technology for actual payment, which is the last step.
We've got a few questions, and they all revolve around single platform or platforms that speak together or speak to one another in a uniform way. What do you guys see as the future for an ecosystem where there isn't, perhaps it's a single platform, but perhaps equally it's a a series of platforms that can interchange information, hopefully as seamlessly as possible, to make the network more efficient.
I'll go short answer, let Pravinder, because he's the expert in here. But from our view, interoperability or a single platform, whether it's one or the other, is I think where we need to go in the future.
Yeah.
Right. We have a history of maybe not necessarily completely sharing everything, but I think for the sake of the intermodal industry and how we compete against truck, that's where we need to go.
Yeah. And I think for us, kind of, we are a independent, neutral platform, right? We have been fortunate kind of to have customers who are connected to it for kind of years now, right? I think what we have gotten to is today, I don't think we have any IMC which is not connected to the platform, right? So we have kind of almost all railroads are connected. Race side, I think we have gotten to about 85% of the motor carriers which are in US and Canada are part of the platform now on the connectivity side. But at the same time, we realized that Blume will not be the only platform, which is what, Craig, your point on interoperability was. And this whole notion has been that we are a business network, right, which is what the platform is and on the network. And there may be other business networks that we have to collaborate with and interoperate with, and they will continue to evolve and come to. But as an ecosystem, it has continued to evolve to a point that it's just a necessity, right? So if you look at our personal lives, whether it's LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook and other, they're all now platforms, right, which are being used. And the consumer side, we seem to be more open to sharing things and being on a single platform. And the business side, it's not a comment only on the intermodal side, it's all along. It looks like that we are always 5 to 10 years behind on what has happened on the consumer technologies that we are trying to apply kind of on this side. But we strive to be that platform, right, for intermodal too. And we will continue to look at kind of other platforms and how do we interoperate with them when we are not the only platform kind of on
Right.
on an intermodal side.
Well, gentlemen, I wish that we could keep going because I think it's a fascinating topic. We've got a lot more questions that unfortunately we can't get to. My apologies to the folks who are sending those in. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Audience, thank you for hanging in there with us. We really appreciate you being here. It's a treat for us to bring these industry experts to you. So we very much appreciate you taking the time. If you'd like some more information about IANA or our educational programs, head on over to intermodal.org and you'll find a lot of information about Intermodal, the association, and the educational program there. A big thank you to Pravinder and the good folks at Blume Global for making this possible today. It was a great topic and a great conversation, and we really appreciate it. And a big shout out to Craig for chunking out this time to spend and giving us a little inside peek into what's happening at Norfolk Southern, the great stuff that's going on there, and just helping us navigate this interesting time that we're all in. So with that, I would like to say thank you to everyone. Please, everyone, stay safe. Keep vigilant, and we will hopefully see you all in person in September at Intermodal Expo.